Welcome to episode 10 in season 2 of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series. Our conversation continues on cannabis. We're talking smoking hot Canna Talk, conversations about cannabis with Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Secretary General of the JAIAC. Dr. Malcolm, welcome again.
Thank you, Anika.
All right, Doc, we're going to continue. We started and we spoke a little bit in the previous episode about the business side of cannabis. And let's look a little bit more towards the regulatory side. And we're going to start with the future of cannabis.
I think over time, we've seen over the last, let's say, 20, 30 or so years, a progressive move towards decriminalization, in some instances, legalization of cannabis. And in fact, in circumstances where I think, if I were to think of some of our musicians, for example, Peter Tosh, who was an ardent fighter for legalize it and so on, they would be quite happy now were they alive to see what has happened over time. And we've had those progressive movements, and the progressive movements have not only been in small states. Even within the US itself, we've seen over that period that we've seen states move from positions of hard prohibition into decriminalization in some instances, legalization in other places, and so on. And we've seen that move going across a number of states. And we've seen a re-engagement of conversation about the effects of cannabis and how it should be treated in relation to the prohibition status and how it is treated as an illicit drug. And interestingly enough, even in sport, we recently saw a situation with Sha'Carri Richardson, the US sprinter, who was prevented from participating in the Tokyo Olympics because of a doping offense related to cannabis. And what we saw happening subsequent to that, the rules were changed to mean that in her sort of circumstances going forward, the same sort of approach that was taken to her would not now be taken because a lighter touch approach is being adopted. And we're hearing more and more conversations about whether or not there's a better way to treating with the questions related to cannabis. So my own view is that over time, maybe not anytime soon, but certainly over time, we're going to see progressive moves going forward. And that is always going to be dependent of who occupies particular political offices and so on. But I think over time, we're going to see a growing swell towards saying, look, let us find a better way of managing what is a problem. And let us find a better way also of dealing with what is a beneficial plant, even if it has elements to it which are not what we would want. So the future is bright, it could be said in some areas, or dark in others. You could see lots of smoke which darkens the place, right? So that is how you look at it. But I think certainly on the medicinal side, you're going to see increasing moves to greater use of cannabis-related products. But on the recreational side, I'm also thinking that we're going to see greater moves towards it being made available for recreation in small dosages.
And what about the business?
Well, the business clearly flows along with that. If you have opening up in relation to recreational and medicinal value and use of it, then clearly you need a product to support that. And so businesses will automatically develop. And remember, the moment you cross that major hump of being no longer illicit, then the banks will be in a position where they no longer have to worry about supporting a business which could lead to their own problems and threats to their own viability. And the question of money laundering and so on is no longer going to be as critical. So you're then going to have a banking sector which is much more able to support the business activities. But having said that, I would also say that as you think about it, even when the banks engage, should that happen, in supporting the cannabis industry more than they do now, my own approach and the approach I've suggested to others is that cannabis really should be treated. You should take a project finance approach, the bankers that is, to cannabis and how you deal with it. And the project finance approach is one which is risk-based, where you go out, you look at the risks associated not just with the production, but a situation where banks go back to doing what old bankers would do, which is to make sure that you visit the farms where they're existing, you make sure that their contaminants are kept out, you make sure that product quality is maintained, and so on. Why? Because the moment a problem arises and it is thought that you as banker financed an activity or financed a product which you did not take sufficient care and control to ensure quality and so on was maintained, you could then open yourselves up to another level of risk. So my approach then and suggestion, recommendation if it were to be considered so, is that as we open up, as we get there, thinking futuristically, future gazing, as we get there, the banks also have to take a much more involved position, which means knowing what happens from seed to market and ensuring that quality control is maintained and that the bankable projects rather that come to them for financing are financed on conditions with milestone payments and so on being made where they are satisfied that product quality can be assured.
That's a very important point, Doc. Very important point. Let's talk about the long-term viability of the industry itself, though.
The viability of the industry is always going to be supported by need. And I don't think you're going to anytime soon move beyond persons having need for cannabis, whether for recreational or medicinal purposes. That need is established and it can only grow. Because I also believe that if you get the illicit element of it removed and you have more and more researchers and so on involved in trying to unlock the potential, medicinal and other potential of it, you are likely, and more likely than not, going to find that you have new products and services being developed. Those new products and services will have markets available. They will need financing to be supported, and you will have economies being created around them. So the long-term viability and sustainability, I think, can be assured. Again, I go back to saying that critical hump is the critical hump of ensuring that you have the illicit nature being removed at global level, which will then allow for the industry to develop as I think it can.
Let's talk about the regulators' role in getting us past that hump, as you put it.
Well, the regulator's role always is to create, in my view, an enabling environment for things to happen. So that role as well includes that they must satisfy themselves that product quality is assured and all those sorts of things. So in that, getting back to the project management role that I spoke about, and the fact that bankers need to be more engaged in products, in the product development, if you want to think about it that way. The regulators now must also make themselves available by reference to the science and by reference to the processes that they engage, that the bankers can rely upon them, knowing that they're doing what they need to do to ensure that what comes out and is produced and is sold is good. And you know, one of the things I shudder to think about, actually, let's say in Jamaica or in Bermuda or wherever, let's say you have a cruise ship coming in, right? And persons are in the business of selling supercharged brownies, right? And those supercharged brownies just happen to have a special brand of cannabis included in them, right? And you sell it because you're able to. And a tourist comes off that cruise ship, takes it, eats it, and somehow gets a reaction to it which is not good, right? And then they go back and they are wanting to do what people will do. They try to find persons to take care of liability issues related to that injury that they've sustained. And what are they then going to do? As a lawyer, I'll tell you this, that when you are thinking of bringing a suit, one of the first considerations you have is who is able to bear the cost related to the liability. You will not sow a man of straw. And if it is that you're looking for somebody to sue, the person who is selling may or may not have insurance or anything else to take care of the loss that you have sustained. So you're going to look at the chain. Who produced it? Manufacturer's liability. And you may even go further. Who financed the manufacturer? The bank. So you have a chain that could be created, hence getting back to why it is that it is so critical for all persons to be involved, because if you're not careful and the product quality and so on is not properly secured with the assistance and active support of your regulators, then you could have a situation where you expose a long chain of persons to liability and possibly significant damages, meaning monies to be paid, which could have been avoided had proper measures been put in place related to product assurance and quality.
Doc, it seems like there is a lot more that needs to be done in order to get this industry in the place that we are referring to.
There's a lot to be done, and I think the start of that lot to be done means that we need to have mature and ongoing dialogue. And I don't think, certainly from where I sit, I don't think we have had enough of that dialogue, and we also have not had enough engagement with all what I consider to be the relevant stakeholders. So for example, as we spoke a lot about decriminalization and the development of industries related to cannabis and so on across the Caribbean region, one of the things I have not seen enough of, as I have followed the debates and so on that have happened around it, is the active involvement of persons who can bring a clear financial sector perspective to the dialogue. And financial sector, not just by reference to how much money you can make out of the industry, but by reference to what are some of the regulatory compliance and related limitations and hurdles to be crossed. And I think that dialogue now has to center again around what is it that we're trying to accomplish. And I'm saying you're trying to accomplish in the instance of an industry, a viable industry which makes money. What are the critical success factors there? It must be the success factor of knowing that if you produce, you're able to move your money and you're able to get paid for your goods and services, right? And if that is the case, what are the humps to be created? How do you create money in a society such as ours? In a large society, if I were to cut for a minute. In Canada, for example, where they have taken a very liberal approach to cannabis, they are able to have a significantly large internal market that can sustain an industry. If you were to think of Jamaica, with 3 million people or thereabouts, or if you were to think of an even smaller state within the Caribbean, St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, 40,000 or whatever the number is, right? However good your weed is, it is impossible to create a viable industry from your internal market. So if we're thinking in our region of developing a viable market that can contribute significantly to gross domestic product and economic well-being, we must be thinking of how it is that we're going to be actively able to penetrate the global market. And to penetrate the global market, it must have a significant dialogue focus and attention focus around the financial sector and matters related to it. If you don't have that level of focus, you're missing the most critical, in my view, gap that must be filled in any conversation going forward.
The Caribbean, as a standalone, is the region able to benefit from cannabis?
It is able to benefit from cannabis. But I think one of the things, as I said, we have to do is to ensure that, one, we start speaking with common voices, with a common voice rather than common voices. Because common voices suggest you're still having divergent voices, multiple ones. So let us think we need to start speaking with a common voice. And that common voice must start looking at what are the limitations, including with a financial sector perspective, most importantly in my view. And then start thinking of what are some of the factors in our region that can allow the persons in St. Vincent to grow and export their weed and weed-related products. What are some of the critical success factors in Jamaica? How do we engage the universities and institutions of higher learning more? How do we engage stakeholders and experts in the area of economic law and development with financial sector focus and so on? How do we engage?
But are we likely to see that kind of engagement when domestic markets differ so much for the cannabis, in terms of the cannabis industry in the Caribbean?
I would say this much.
Some countries won't come to the table on that conversation.
It's not a question, in my view, of whether or not we're likely to see it. It's a question of whether or not we should want to see it.
Okay.
So I am speaking now of a standard to be achieved and things that we need to do. And you're correct in that. I remembered, for example, we have been speaking, for example, in the context of the Caribbean about production integration for the longest while. In fact, there was a publication done several years ago that was edited by Professors Hall and Ben. Then Professor Hall, he subsequently became the Governor General of Jamaica. And that book looked at CARICOM looking at moving from theory to action in the context of production integration. Right. So it was production integration, moving from theory to action. I had the good benefit of contributing a chapter to that book. But one of the things that struck me then, and was the position long before, was the extent to which we have been engaging in academic discourse and so on, speaking about the need for production integration across CARICOM with a common vision and being able to move our way forward. Now, in the case of cannabis, we've always been a small market, and the issues that we face in relation to correspondent banking and matters related to that are common. So while I'm not prepared to say, and I don't think I'm going to ever say that you must try to find ways of equalizing how people in St. Vincent grow ganja, how they grow it in Barbados, how they grow it in Jamaica. That's not the conversation I want to have. What I want to have, or to see happen, is a conversation where persons look at what the limiting factors are to success and see how it is that as a region we can pool our resources to be able to bring the best minds together and the best thought leaders together to be able to engage around the real issues, including relation to the science, in relation to research, in relation to banking, in relation to dispute management, where you identify issues, you try to deal with them and manage them and so on. That is a sort of dialogue, and I don't think that sort of dialogue or involvement will in any way at all affect the market conditions that you spoke about. So there are two levels at which we're concerned. Of course, it would be good if we are able to integrate markets, but even if we don't get to integrate markets, there is a level beyond that, or in addition to that, that we may yet be able to do, which would not, in my view, be problematic, provided we have the will to do it.
Let me remind you that you're in tune to the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series, Conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm. This is the second of our two-part discussion on cannabis. Smoking Hot Canna Talk, conversations about cannabis. What should the next steps be for the cannabis industry?
There is, notwithstanding, I think, that across the Caribbean region, steps have been taken to enable the development of particularly medicinal cannabis, right? And notwithstanding that you have had regulatory and other authorities being set up to deal with this, what we've heard, if you go across the region, is that there are persons who are still unsure about what can be done. What we've also heard is that there are bankers who are saying it is not that we are unprepared to finance and support the industry, but we find ourselves unable to do so. Right? Because we do not want to threaten our own viability. What we've also seen and heard are these same bankers and others saying that a lot of the limitations are external to the region, many of them related to the regulatory and other approaches that are adopted in the United States of America. So the next steps, clearly in my view, must lead to a re-engagement of all the relevant players in the region, our regulators, our producers, our persons in academia, legal practitioners, accountants, all the parties that could come together to enable the establishment of a viable business. And then once that has been done, the question must now be determined, having regard to the limitations that are faced, including in particular, limitations in another jurisdiction over which we have limited or no control, right? In fact, I would dare say no control, right? What can we do by way of advocacy? What can we do by producing viable research and so on to make our case that what we're asking for is something viable, and to make our case as well that we have the capacity to establish industries which are able to maintain good value standards and all the other things. And getting back to an early question you asked, that is why it's so important for us as a region to work together. Why? Because if you're going to be seeking to penetrate these other markets which you require, you are going to have to make sure that your quality assurance and related standards are high. And that when you say you are producing a product with 20 X's, it doesn't have 20 X's plus one, sort of thing.
Yes.
So you want to ensure that that happens. And the way to do that is to pool the resources we have, including in science, knowing that we have limited resources anyway. Work them together so we can be able to achieve those very high and discriminating standards that we need to develop in order to show that we have the capacity to develop an industry, whether it is medicinal solely or medicinal and recreational, that will not put people at risk. And that is something I think as the next steps go, that we're going to have to bear in mind as we seek to move this industry forward. If it is to become an industry, because quite frankly, until you have something which is capable of producing profits and capable of generating itself as a business, I'm not so sure you can speak about it as an industry.
Right. So notion, no. Of an
It is a notion, but let's see where we go from there.
All right, Doug. Smoking Hot Canna Talk. Canna Talk. What is the significance of this title?
Well, there is a history to that in that ganja, or cannabis in our region, is something which traditionally persons have smoked, right? And it is something as well which persons have had discussions about, sometimes not as openly as they could be, and sometimes in need of greater platforms such as what we are hopefully having here, to have the issues dealt with in a way that makes sense. It is a talk as well which we're hoping will take the issues to the fore, where we will have more and more persons engaging around it. And it is smoking hot because it is still in that vein where it is still a hot topic.
Very much.
It has been a hot topic and a hot topic for very long. And it continues to be a hot topic and will always be, because there are so many implications surrounding it. And it is something which is cutting across so many sectors of our societies, and which is also having so many implications in criminal justice and criminal justice reform, in economic growth and development, talk around it as to what it may or may not be able to do, in relation to what its value is considered to be globally and all these things. So there is that element to it. And I think if we focus on something, see it for what it is, talk about it plainly, speak about it futuristically as well, and lock our heads around saying, not everything that is bad or considered to be bad has everything about it that is bad. There is good that comes out of bad. They say there's God and there's a devil. And the truth is that the world exists both. And we have to understand that in any environment that we're in, even things that appear to be bad may well have good in them. And sometimes what we have to try to do is to see how it is that we can engage meaningfully. And if that meaningful engagement say you need to park that to the left, you park it there. But if the meaningful engagement say we should find a way to move forward, then we should. Until then, it is a hot topic to be discussed. And it is a hot topic that I think we all should engage in, because believe it or not, whether we want to accept it or not, it is not going away.
Everything about this topic is really smoking hot, Doc. But I'll give you the last word as we wrap up the part 2 of this discussion.
All right. If you were to ask me final words on this topic, I would say that cannabis is an area that requires mature discussion. It is something about which we should not hide our heads in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist, or that there are not real issues around it. It is an area, I think, which is exciting from an academic as well as from a practitioner perspective. Why? Because it engages science, it engages law, it engages everything in a very significant way, and it engages significantly for us critical international relations and banking relationship issues that must be considered for you to be able to move it forward. It also means that we have to be careful as we're thinking about it and as we're moving forward, that we in our small jurisdictions, as we think about creating an industry of it, should ensure that we're in lockstep with what is happening at the international level. Because we have to recognize that for us to create viable businesses out of it, we cannot do so simply by reference to ourselves. We have to do so by reference to how we're able to involve and integrate into what is happening in a broader global environment. So that is something that has to go there. I think we also need to ensure, as we're looking at it, that we find a way to bring the right perspectives on board. And those right perspectives are not simply growers and sellers and manufacturers and so on. It will include and must include people who are in the financial services sector. It must include people who are in the international relations sector. And importantly as well, it must recognize that if you're talking business, you're talking underlying contracts, you're talking underlying all sorts of things. And when I think contracts, it's not simply the case, I believe, that you must get somebody to simply put some good commercial contracts in place. You need to get persons who understand the relevant conflicts that arise out of the industry. And therefore, who is able to take, or who those persons who are able to take, a conflicts management approach or disputes management approach to the table, so that as you're devising the businesses, as you're trying to develop advocacy and other solutions, you're doing so with conflict/disputes management at the core. And I dare say, in this context, your financial services sector professionals and persons who are able to engage with them, including by reference to dispute management, are the key factors to be brought on board, in addition, of course, to your scientists and the other people who have always been there. And I mentioned the latter too, because the scientists we have always thought to be important.
Yes.
The dispute management practitioners we very often don't, and part of that reason is that even as we're looking at cannabis and looking at businesses, we still do what we very often do, even in relation to other businesses, which is to decentralize rather than centralize the role of dispute management and how it should factor in how we create and seek to move our businesses forward.
Excellent. Before we go, here's today's Did You Know fact. Did you know that adjudication involves a process where a neutral third party hears a dispute and renders a decision which is binding on the parties unless overridden by a subsequent arbitration or litigation decision on the same facts? The INeutral platform offers access to digital adjudication and other alternative dispute resolution modalities at your fingertips. Before we go, here are some highlights of Season 2 episodes.
If you're talking about tourism, one of the areas of tourism is the area of cruise shipping. But for there to be a cruise shipping industry, what do you need? You need piers. What are some of the inherent risks related to that? There may be dredging contracts which are not properly carried out. There may be building where the concrete is not properly poured. There may be issues in relation to you ask for a pier to be able to accommodate 3 Oasis class vessels. The contractor delivers something that only has capacity for 2 Oasis class vessels. And these are some of the things that are related there. In the context of small economies, an investment in a pier is very often a huge chunk of the gross domestic product. And it is something which very often you have to think twice about doing, in the understanding that if you do it well and it generates income, the economy as a whole will benefit. The same could happen for your airports and everything else. But what happens there is that because sometimes you're small and you have limited capacity, including negotiating capacity, very often a lot of small and even emerging economies end up in a situation where they do not have the requisite skill sets to properly negotiate their contracts.
Olint and NCB. Let's talk about that landmark case. What are some of the takeaway issues that were involved in that case?
Well, for those persons who are not aware, Olint and NCB is a little dated by now, but not in the context of the principles that came out of it. But in short, what had happened is that in Jamaica, there was an entity called Olint, which was in the business of assisting persons in doing foreign exchange transactions. And they were operating and had, among other institutions, established banking relationships with the National Commercial Bank of Jamaica. And there came a time when the business of Olint was considered to be risky and in fact subsequently found to have been unlawful at many levels in different jurisdictions, right? So what happened when NCB found itself in a position where they were dealing with Olint as a customer, they then got to a stage where their own appetite for doing business with Olint was lost. And they decided that they would, in fact, disengage from the relationship they had with Olint. And having decided to do that, a court case ensued. And that court case...
Disengage, Doc?
Disengage meaning they decided to terminate the banker-customer relationship, right?
Okay.
So they decided to terminate that relationship. And in doing so, Olint then decided that they really were not in a position where they should have sought to terminate in those circumstances, and they brought an action in court to challenge the decision that had been made. Now, the action, to give the short précis that I'm looking at, continued all the way up to the highest court of Jamaica, which is the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, which is in London. And the court ultimately decided there in favor of NCB by establishing the principle that NCB was able to terminate a relationship with Olint, notwithstanding any other contractual or other relationships that may have existed. And the significant point coming out of it, if, by principle, if you want to look at it that way, was a determination that the bank had an overarching obligation to preserve its own well-being and to preserve the well-being of the economy that it served as a whole. And they should not jeopardize that obligation by reference to any single customer who was involved, who or which, as the case may be, was involved in business activities which was inconsistent or incompatible with their regulatory and other obligations. INeutral is a platform which, as we say, is being used through different institutions at the moment. So if, for example, you were to try to access it through the Jamaica International Arbitration Center, you could do one of two things. You could go to the general JAIAC.org website, and you'd be able to get access to the platform and be able to use it there. Or you could, for short, simply go to INeutral, spelled out, INEUTRAL .JAIAC.org, and that would take you directly to the platform. Once you get there, that's where the excitement begins. Because you get an opportunity to then register your disputes online by simply going through a fillable form. And the form is fillable depending on the nature of the modality that you're using. So it's a form created that allows you to complete it for arbitration, mediation, conciliation, or whatever the modality you have to use. And every other step of the process, right through to completion, is available to be used by reference to templates that are created and are automatically generated via the system. Everything that you need to do, payment of registration fees, you have access to calendars, you have access to following your matters in terms of where they are. And if you have multiple matters registered in the system, you're also able to follow each of them as they happen. You have access to a unique library for each matter. We're trained in this idea of law and the practice of it being adversarial by nature. We have to now reimagine that whole process to a point where we're saying, yes, it may be adversarial by nature and we all have divergent views, fine. But at the end of the day, we should have a common goal of trying to see projects completed within time, within budget, and the lawyers work seamlessly with all the other professionals and everybody are joined in that mutual interest-related goal. Then what you then find happening is that we're able to get to that end in a way where avoidance becomes key. Because if we all want to have the project completed with minimum disruption, maximum profitability, and easiest time delivery and all of those sorts of things, then we understand that the moment we allow conflicts to manifest into big, unmanageable, sometimes disputes, then you have a situation where the projects will be overburdened. They will come in out of time. They will be over budget and all these things. And that is not key. But avoidance of the dispute or preventing the dispute manifesting will allow us to do all the things we want. So we now have to think of what, not whether, dispute avoidance should be implemented? Do we want to put in dispute assessment boards? Do we want to put in positions for ongoing amicable discussions between the parties? Do we want to put in some other form of monitoring to ensure that at the end of the day, we all have a project that can proceed seamlessly to an end where we avoid rather than have to deal with resolution at the end? When you're thinking about the business of legalization and establishing of businesses related to cannabis, the most important factor, in my view, is that you must first consider what are the available banking relationships that you can carve out. Let's say there's a business A in Jamaica that is in the business of producing the best quality marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it, and it is in high demand in, let's say, Canada. There's a Canadian market that you have that is readily available. You have a buyer who is prepared to buy as much as you can produce. In fact, they go further. They're prepared to give you all the investment you need to help you grow the business.
Yes.
But after you have produced that, and you then decide to sell it to them, you find yourself in a position where you have issues shipping the weed legally. Let's just use that for one moment. But then it goes further. You have a difficulty shipping it. So you now have an available market, you have an available product, but you cannot get it from the point of production to the point of demand.
I'm Anika Nelson on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, saying thank you for joining us. It's sponsored by the JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
The Caribbean Development Bank, reducing poverty and transforming lives through sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. Special thanks to ADEB Consultants, consulting engineers in the Caribbean for over 57 years. Regis, work your way. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution. Wassel & Wassel Arbitrator Services Incorporation. INeutral Dispute Resolution Made Easy. CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner. And Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean.
The way we do business has changed. Don't be left behind. Choose a hybrid solution for your workforce. Regis offers furnished, equipped, ready-to-use office space available for days, months, or years. Our fully serviced private office spaces give teams of all sizes an inspiring environment to focus, collaborate, and do their best work. The world is switching to hassle-free hybrid working. Join the revolution. Switch to Regis. Call 876-618-8800 or visit regis.com.jm. That's regus.com.jm.
All our episodes are also distributed on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.